Quick note, most of this was recorded before the Secret of the Mimic trailer, which is why you won't hear me bring it up until the end of the video. A couple months ago, Help Wanted 2 received an update featuring a plushie of Tiger Rock, a form the Mimic takes in Tales from the Pizzaplex. At the same time, an updated build for 5 Laps at Freddy's showed a billboard with a vacuum by Murray Co., suggesting that Edwin Murray, creator of the Mimic, exists in the games. Many people seem to have finally taken these as confirmation that Tales from the Pizzaplex is in fact canon to the games, though by no means everyone. And even among those who do accept it, a lot of them still reject Fazbear Frights as being in the same continuity as the games. And so, despite these big reveals, FNAF's continuity issue rages on. And this issue extends beyond just these 2 book series. We can all agree that the mainline games are canon, right? But when it comes to everything else in the franchise, the many books and side games, all of it is thrown into question. When something new comes out that isn't a mainline game, the one thing you can count on is heated arguments over whether it's actually canon. Some people say this is all the fandom's fault for not being able to accept things they don't like. But I'm gonna argue that much of the fault lies on the FNAF franchise itself, because it certainly does not make things easier. And the biggest illustration of this is Into the Pit, the game. When it was first announced, people hoped this would finally be the thing to confirm or debunk the canonicity of the books. Instead, it seems to have had the opposite effect, only adding more fuel to the fire. Some theorists would have you believe that this game actually made the issue crystal clear that it shows the books are undoubtedly canon. But even as someone who thinks the books are canon, let me tell you, it absolutely did not do that. In terms of continuity, Into the Pit is an absolute nightmare, and we need to talk about it. But first, I want to go back to the origins of FNAF's canonicity issue to lay the foundation for Into the Pit's release. Fans have been debating continuity as early as FNAF World. Later, the canonicity of the Survival Logbook and FNAF AR, or parts of AR, were called into question. But these debates would pale in comparison to Fazbear Frights, and later Tales from the Pizzaplex. Ever since MatPat made his Step Closer theory, using the story as a parallel for Mike and the Crying Child, the vast majority of people seem to take Fazbear Frights as being non-canon, with the lore reveals coming in the form of parallels. And then the Ultimate Guide came out. It talked about the Stitch Wraith Stingers as if they were in the same universe as the games, saying things like, the incident shown in Pizzeria Simulator and its aftermath are revisited via police evidence. It seems that Cassette Man's plan did not work exactly as intended. And Larson pulls the puppet from an evidence locker, where evidence from the Pizzeria Simulator fire is housed. From that point onward, opinions seem to shift, with a lot more people taking Frights to be literally canon. Tales from the Pizzaplex came out next, and more people seem to accept this series as canon from the get-go. It presents itself as the story of the origin of the Pizzaplex, and gives almost no reason to not be canon. Of course, the majority of people carried over their opinion from Fazbear Frights, which was that the anthology books would all be alternative universe stories with parallels to the games. As time progressed, and as each new book came out, the schism in the FNAF community grew wider, becoming more heated as people became increasingly irritated with those they disagree with. Those in favor of Fazbear Frights being canon mainly hold to a theory called Stitchline Games. In this theory, only the epilogues, or the Stitch Wraith Stingers as they're called, and the stories connected to them are in the game's continuity. They mainly point to the fact that Scott literally said some stories will be directly connected to the games, and to some stories like The Man in Room 1280, which seems to just directly explain Ultimate Custom Night, with little reason to be a parallel. Others believe that most or even all of the Fright stories are canon. As far as I can tell, everyone who believes in Fazbear Frights canonicity also believes in Tales being canon. But there's a large portion of people who only believe Tales is canon, and not Frights, and for fairly good reason. The case for Tales from the Pizzaplex is a lot stronger than for Fazbear Frights. The majority of stories take place in the Pizzaplex, which is of course the setting for Security Breach. The story GGY just straight up explains Gregory's character, revealing that he's patient 46 from the therapy CDs, and it has literally no reason to be a non-canon parallel of some sort. And from a prototype copy of Submechanophobia, we know that changes were made to Bobby Dot's Part 1 specifically to make it more accurate to Security Breach. There's also an old description for Tales that says it's set in the world of the newest games. And then, of course, there's the Mimic, who has multiple stories and all of the epilogues dedicated to him. And as we know, the Mimic appeared in ruin underneath the Pizzaplex, lining up with the epilogues. But also, if Tails is canon, that's actually another point for Frights to be canon too, because the very first story in Tales is Frailty, which directly connects itself to Frights as it follows another victim of Eleanor, exactly like in To Be Beautiful. Those who are completely against the books being canon, who still exist even after the recent reveals, mainly point to some apparent contradictions in the two book series, which are greater for Frights than for Tales. Frights depends on there being a sixth victim of the MCI, Andrew, and the games clearly describe there only being 5 missing children. Another major detail is that the puppet mask sinks to the bottom of a lake in the Stingers, but in Security Breach it's still in the FNAF 6 pizzeria on Tangle. As for Tales, people will point out other seeming contradictions, like the Pizzaplex's shape or the attractions being different from Security Breach, even though the books say there's some renovations, and by the time of Bobby Dots, the Pizzaplex is described exactly like the game. Also, if Frailty connects Tales to Frights, and Frights isn't canon, then Tales, by extension, must also not be canon. Ironically though, Frailty can actually be used to argue against Tales and Frights being connected, since the story doesn't actually fit anywhere in the Frights timeline because of the heart pendant. Anyway, this debate raged on for years, and then Into the Pit was released. It's an adaptation of the first Fazbear Fright story of the same name. It also references many of the other stories, meaning that if this game is canon to the main timeline, the rest of Frights probably is as well. The issue, of course, is in determining whether this game is actually canon. But first, I think it's important to clarify what we actually mean by the word canon. You could go with a very strict definition that doesn't allow for even the slightest contradiction, but that isn't very helpful. Minor contradictions can naturally arise between two things that are meant to go together. A much more helpful definition would be something that is intended to be in the same continuity or timeline as something else, even if some discrepancies exist. This is what actually tells us whether we're supposed to take lore hints from one piece of media and directly apply them to another. Now, if something lines up perfectly with the games, there's little reason for it not to exist in the same timeline. But if there are major contradictions, that's pretty good evidence that it's meant to take place in a different continuity. But we also need to allow for a certain amount of wiggle room for fun Easter eggs and references that aren't intended to be taken seriously. But here's the problem with this game. There's no way of telling the difference between what's intended to have lore implications and what's a fun Easter egg with no meaning, or a change made for gameplay, or just an overlooked inconsistency. Some details are easy to label, like Bounce Pod and GGY, which are clearly just fun Easter eggs. But everything else in the game is much more challenging. Because of this, Into the Pit is basically impossible to place on the timeline. If details are to be considered equally, this game simultaneously takes place before FNAF 3 and after FNAF 3. Here's what implies it takes place before FNAF 3. Jeff's Pizza is full of Freddy Fazbear's pizza stuff that the Fazbear's Fright team would have taken away when they came by. For instance, the Paper Pals, which were taken to Fazbear's Fright, are still in Jeff's Pizza. Also, these drawings and posters from Fazbear's Fright. There are even 2 arcade machines in Jeff's deliberately made to resemble the ones in FNAF 3. This demands that Into the Pit takes place before FNAF 3. Trash and the gang also appear in the dumpsters outside the mill, and in Pizzeria Simulator we can buy these guys from Dumpster Diver Weekly. This right here doesn't necessarily mean the game's before FNAF 3. It could mean it's after FNAF 3, but before Pizza Sim, but everything else contradicts this as a possibility, as I will now show. Because here's everything that implies Into the Pit takes place not just after FNAF 3, but after Pizza Sim 2. The Stitch Wraith can appear outside of Oswald's window in an Easter egg, and we know the Stitch Wraith wasn't created until after Pizza Sim. He was created in the 3rd Stitch Wraith Stinger, which takes place after Fetch, which is after the man in room 1280, which is after Pizza Sim, which is, of course, after FNAF 3. There are also secret minigames representing 3 Fazbear Fright stories: Fetch, To Be Beautiful, and Count the Ways. We can only access these minigames inside the ball pit, which implies the ball pit already holds the memories of these victims and that the events shown have already happened. This is important because the story Fetch doesn't happen until after the man in room 1280. Also, To Be Beautiful happens shortly before the first epilogue, which takes place after the 3rd epilogue. Both of these necessitate that the game takes place after Pizza Sim. So which is it then? Before FNAF 3 or after? Because it obviously can't be both. If Into the Pit is before FNAF 3, it contradicts any logical progression of events. The Stitch Wraith cannot logically exist until after the fire in Pizzeria Simulator, unless the Stitch Wraith is just something entirely different in this game and has a completely different origin story, I guess. If Into the Pit is after FNAF 3, why is there still Freddy stuff that the Fazbear's Fright crew would have taken? Even if they left some stuff and didn't take everything, what about the Paper Pals and the arcade cabinets that we know for a fact were taken? Which of these details do we deem important and which do we ignore? Maybe some of them are just fun references. Except neither the arcades nor the Stitch Wraith make sense to be fun, meaningless Easter eggs, because unlike the GGY reference and Bounce Pot, which are out of place and don't have any reasonable lore implications, these things have clear connections to the original Into the Pit story and the overarching book series the story is from. And judging from the Fetch, To Be Beautiful, and Count the Ways minigames, Mega Cat Studio cared about the overarching story of Frights. And even if you want to argue that the Stitch Wraith isn't a meaningful Easter egg, the Frights minigames undoubtedly are important. They aren't fun little references, they're literally essential to get the 3-star canon ending. If these details aren't meaningless then, that means that we do have actual contradictions on our hands. Again though, it's important to note that unintentional contradictions don't necessarily make a game non-canon. At the very least, it can still be intended to be canon. But it also doesn't do us any good to know that a game is canon if we don't know what details were mistakes and what weren't. So how are we supposed to decide which details are important to timeline placement and which to ignore, without running afoul of confirmation bias, that is? Well, if we knew the year Into the Pit takes place from other information, that would certainly help. The graphic novel adaptation of the original story suggests that it takes place in 2020, and leaked details of the scrapped ARG website also support the year 2020 for the game. Depending on when FNAF 3 is, 2015, 2017, or 2023, this could be before or after. If you want to know why FNAF 3 could be in 2015 or 2017, see the theory I made on the survival logbook. However, there's also a calendar in the game which lines up with the year 2018. It may be important to note that this calendar doesn't update as the week progresses, so could it have just been an overlooked inconsistency? Again, it's difficult to label, especially considering the insane attention to detail in this game, and how Mega Cat was clearly paying attention to the other calendar in the game, given how they changed it. But there is graffiti at the beginning of the game that looks like 2018 as well. Overall though, we can't arrive at a definitive answer for the game's year, leaving everything just as confusing. But the timeline contradictions are just the tip of the iceberg. The restaurant's layout, for instance, is completely different from FNAF 1. Now, if some things were changed slightly, it could be excused for gameplay purposes, but the layout isn't even remotely the same. Look at the map of Into the Pit's restaurant versus FNAF 1's. I don't even know where to begin trying to line these up. If we rotate Into the Pit's map 90 degrees to the left, so that the stage is at the back, like in FNAF 1, you can see that nothing is even close to its proper place. The security office is clear on the opposite side of the building. There's only one door to the office instead of two, and it doesn't even lead to a hallway, but to storage. The kitchen is also on the opposite side of the building, or at least on the opposite side of the stage. The safe room, instead of being to the right of the stage, is, again, on the complete opposite side of the building, in the arcade. There clearly wasn't even an attempt at making it resemble the FNAF 1 location. It's also a known fact of FNAF that the missing kids were lured into the safe room, where they were then killed. But in Into the Pit, both the original story and the game, the children were killed in a party room instead of the safe room. We can also observe that the party room is sealed off in the present, which could be a parallel to the safe room being sealed off in the games. After all, in the games, the kids were killed in the safe room, and the safe room was later boarded up. In Into the Pit, the kids were killed in the party room, and the party room was boarded up. Now, The Week Before, which is a prequel to FNAF 1, does mention that there were other rooms that were closed off. Quote, "It seems like whole sections of the building have been closed off over the years, or perhaps they're expansions that were abandoned before completion." Phone Guy later confirms that there was in fact an abandoned expansion which was never completed. Combine this with the fact that we already know one other room, the safe room, was closed off, and it becomes doubtful that this book is referring to one of the party rooms being sealed off. Especially when neither of the two party rooms in The Week Before are sealed off, and Into the Pit shows that there were only ever two party rooms to begin with. There were also other problems with the fetch minigame. In the original Fetch story, the Freddy Fazbear's Pizza is in a beach town, which is definitely not Hurricane, Utah, so it can't be the FNAF 1 location. But the Fetch minigame is clearly set at the same pizzeria as Into the Pit. It has the same layout, and Golden Freddy appears in the storage room in the exact same place. This contradicts the books, but it doesn't necessarily contradict the games, if the books aren't actually canon. But what does contradict the games is Golden Freddy. If Golden Freddy is still at the pizzeria and is possessed, that places the minigame before Follow Me, when the classic animatronics were melted into Remnant. And Fetch can't happen at that point in time, unless Fetch the dog is just completely different in the games and not possessed by Andrew or William. There are also some smaller things. If the kid in the Fetch minigame is supposed to be Greg, his hair color is wrong. It should be blonde. And in Count the Ways, Funtime Freddy doesn't have Bonbon like the minigame shows. But in my opinion, those are pretty trivial mistakes. All in all though, the game is an absolute mess of contradictions. Now, there have been some theories to explain some of these contradictions, notably the timeline errors. By far the most popular is loop theory. It's based on the idea that Eleanor's victims in Fazbear Frights are trapped inside the pit, stuck in a looping memory of their demise. The theory is that Oswald has already died and is now continually looping through the memory. As it loops, the memory starts to break down for some reason, and details from the present begin to show up in the loop, warping the memory. So, even though the memory is of events that happened before FNAF 3, the loop instance that we're experiencing in the game and book is after FNAF 3. This would explain why things apparently from the future appear in the game. The Stitch Wraith's appearance is him entering the loop to fix the memory, making it happy, as he does in the final epilogue for all of Eleanor's victims. But this theory is fundamentally flawed because its basic premise is wrong. Eleanor's victims in the pit aren't looping through the memory of their demise. This comes from a misreading of the Stitch Wraith stingers. The final epilogue shows that Millie from Count the Ways has been stuck in a forest, wandering endlessly, until Jake, the Stitch Wraith, pulls her out. There's no timeline loop or recurring experience, and it doesn't even have anything to do with the way she died or the events leading up to her death. Jake doesn't even fix the memory she's currently in. When he starts leading her out of the forest, she suddenly just appears in the happy memory. The endless forest and the fixed memory are two entirely separate places. But even ignoring this fact, nothing in the game suggests that Oswald is living in a loop, and neither does Return to the Pit, which I'll talk more about at the end of this video. The original story has a happy ending with Oswald living, and there's nothing suggesting that this was his fixed memory of a previous death. If it were, Jake would have showed up. Also, when Jake fixed the memories of Eleanor's victims, he appeared in his human form, not as the Stitch Wraith like he does in Oswald's window. He also doesn't even do anything to help in the Easter egg. Oswald does draw Freddy's characters before he ever sees them, but this was in the original story too, where there clearly wasn't any intention of there being a loop or of Oswald being dead. It's more than likely just supernatural shenanigans, or the 0 point field, which is explored in Fetch. Loop theory was really only created out of a necessity to explain the timeline contradictions. There's no actual direct evidence pointing to it. If there were anything in the multiple variations of Into the Pit, or anywhere in Frights that established the idea of living in a loop, I'd be willing to consider this theory. But there isn't. An alternate theory, which I'll discuss briefly, is that Oswald has psychic abilities, being able to see visions of the future. According to this theory, the Stitch Wraith and the Frights minigames were visions of the future that Oswald saw. The theory pulls some concepts from Fetch and what we found about the 0 point field and psychics, and it makes some fairly good points. But rather than do a thorough examination of this theory, since this video is already so long, I just want to make one point. The secret minigames can specifically only be triggered inside the ball pit, not in the normal world, which implies that the ball pit is what holds the memories, not Oswald. Everything else in the game is due to supernatural memories stored in the ball pit, so I don't see why it wouldn't be the explanation here as well, especially since we know the ball pit does hold these memories of Eleanor's victims at some point in time. And without the minigames, you're left with the Stitch Wraith being the only instance of Oswald supposedly seeing a vision of the future, which seems very unlikely to me. It just generally feels like evidence is lacking for both of these theories. I would love to have a relatively simple explanation for the apparent inconsistencies, but I'm just not really convinced by them. And even still, while both the loop and psychic theories attempt to solve timeline contradictions, they don't address any of the other contradictions in the game. Some people have instead argued that Into the Pit is just a fun spin-off game for the anniversary, and because it's a spin-off, unlike the main games, it must not be in the same continuity, just like FNAF World, the Freddy in Space games, and 5 Laps at Freddy's. This is supported by the fact that Scott in the interview said it was only intended to be a small novelty game. And I'm sorry, but this is just really bad reasoning. To start with, Scott never called it a spin-off game. But sure, the game could be considered a spin-off in the sense that it diverges from the main games in terms of gameplay and narrative, but that doesn't automatically equal non-canon. I've noticed that some people will call it a spin-off under this definition of the term, which says nothing about its canonicity, but then suddenly switch definitions and use spin-off to mean having no direct ties to the main story. But obviously, those are not equivalent. A game can have different gameplay and graphics and still be connected to the main series. Scott did say it was originally planned to be a smaller game, but that's exactly how Help Wanted started out as well. Help Wanted was only supposed to be a VR recreation of FNAF 1, but then grew into a much larger game, which is undoubtedly canon. The same thing happened with Into the Pit.
They could have stopped with just a little simple novelty game, but they just kept going. They just turned into this big, full-fledged, full-sized game.
So this really isn't a good argument for the game not being canon. Others, though, arguing in favor of its canonicity, simply say, it's a game, and all games, excluding the joke and troll games, have been in the same continuity, so Into the Pit must be as well. But of course, there's a first for everything. Scott absolutely could make an alternate universe game if he wanted. Nothing forbids a non-canon game from ever being made, so this is far from a foolproof argument. So then, after finally going through everything, is the game canon? Like I mentioned before, contradictions don't necessarily make a game non-canon. A handful of mistakes in a game doesn't mean that we're not intended to treat it as if it's in the same continuity. Scott isn't perfect. He's admitted before that, despite his effort, he still makes mistakes. And this was when he was making small games all by himself. Adding another game studio working on a much bigger project only makes mistakes more likely to happen, especially when the studio goes radio silent for over 6 months at a time.
They would go into the hole for 6, 7, 8 months at a time, and I wouldn't hear anything from them, to the point where I thought, is this okay? But then I would get an update, and it would just be all this crazy new stuff and all this crazy detail, and then they'd go back into the hole again for 5, 6, 7 months.
I think a perfect illustration of the bad communication is the scrapped Vanny minigames. The minigames representing the Fright stories are actually reskinned versions of minigames about Vanny or Vanessa. Michael O 2000 made a great video going over these cut minigames, which you can watch for more detail. But basically, the Fetch minigame was originally about Vanny leading children to William. The To Be Beautiful minigame was about Vanessa putting animatronics together and having her bring a dead child to Chica. And the Count the Ways minigame had Vanessa cleaning up various things from a party before finally coming to a mess of some kind. Obviously, this could never work timeline-wise. Even if Vanessa is William's daughter in the games, she'd have to have been born a minimum of 12 years after the MCI, while these games act like she was alive at the time. It seems like these minigames were following the movie timeline for some reason. And yeah, the minigames were changed before release, but even if they were created as just a pitch to Scott, it shows that Megacat has a very poor understanding of FNAF's continuity to think this could ever work. And with Megacat making Into the Pit with so little direction from Scott, as he said, the game is much more prone to having contradicting details, and not everything might have been caught. Now, DJ Surf, a playtester for the game, actually gave some insight into the Easter eggs and details that Megacat put in.
But they went into the books, they figured out what they could add, what Easter eggs, they wanted to add in and all that. The problem was, as well, you didn't want to put in enough that it either spoiled too much or like it became contrary to the actual lore and all that.
So we know there was an effort to not contradict the lore. However, DJ Surf didn't actually say what lore. Presumably, he's talking about the main timeline's lore, right? But it could be argued that he's talking about this game's own lore, or the book's lore that the game is based on. The Megacat Studios marketing director, Bexy, has also said on Discord that everything in the game had to go through approvals, presumably by Scott. We also know that some things, like the baby poster from the trailer, which would have contradicted the timeline, were changed or removed, possibly because fans pointed out the contradiction. So if an effort was made to not have Into the Pit contradict the lore of the other games, that strongly implies it's meant to fit in the same continuity, even if Megacat wasn't very good at ensuring that and some details ended up slipping by Scott. But when there are glaring contradictions like the ones we discussed, you start to think, there's no way Scott could have just overlooked this, right? And here's the thing, even if he did overlook these contradictions, it's not even that helpful to label the game as canon, because there's no way to tell what apparent contradictions to ignore and which to accept. Using certain details to prove Into the Pit takes place after FNAF 3 doesn't work well when you had to ignore details suggesting it takes place before FNAF 3, and vice versa. Which details you use and which details you ignore are basically entirely determined by confirmation bias. When a game is canon and supposedly links the books to the games, but half of it contradicts both the books and the games, what do you even do with it? That being said, there are some things you could reasonably infer if Into the Pit was intended to be canon. It would mean that there was a secret sixth child in the MCI, which would be Andrew. The game hammers down on this fact hard. The party room shows 6 bodies, there are 6 balloons you collect in the fetch minigame, and the party hat minigame implies there was a 6th victim. It would also mean that the rest of the Stitch line is probably also canon, since Into the Pit directly connects itself to 3 other fight stories in minigames that are essential to get the 3-star ending. This would mean that Andrew is the vengeful spirit in Ultimate Custom Night, as the man in Room 1280 shows, and not Cassidy. And if the Stitch line connected stories are canon, it means that Tales from the Pizzaplex is probably also canon, since Frailty connects the 2 book series together, even though it has a continuity issue, because the story has no reason to exist otherwise. Also, most of Fazbear Frights being canon would mean that all the talk of parallels was never actually real, and the actual answers given to us in Frights weren't through parallels, but through directly canon material. And in that case, why would Tales not be canon, especially when it connects to the games better than Frights does? As for my opinion on this whole issue, I've believed for a couple years now that the Stitch line connected stories are in fact canon to the games. There are contradictions, of course, but I think it's still intended to be canon. And when Into the Pit was first announced, I believed the game would be canon like the original story, but that people would probably make up excuses for it, right? But as I was playing it, I actually found myself doubting the game was canon. I think it's completely unfair to say that people who doubt its canonicity are coping and saying, if they're not convinced by this, they won't be convinced by anything. Let's be real here. The game could have made a much better case for its canonicity, but instead fails majorly at lining up with the established lore. No one should be acting like anyone is stupid for thinking it isn't canon. But as for me, I think it's probably intended to be canon. I don't think the contradictions are due to loop theory or Oswald being a sidekick. I think they're much more likely to just be mistakes that slip through the cracks and were only discovered by hardcore fans. It's unlikely that most people at Megacat read all of Frights and considered all of the lore points in the games. Scott, of course, should know his own lore, but by his own admission, he does make mistakes. He could have forgotten about some things, or have just not considered the implications of some details in the game. But my main point of this video isn't to convince you of my position. It's to show how ridiculous this book debate has become, and how Into the Pit has not done it any favors. Ultimately, I don't think this game had that much of an impact. It seems that people mostly stayed in the same camps they started in, except now there appears to be a third camp, which thinks Into the Pit and the future Megacat games are canon, but not the books, which makes even less sense to me, but whatever. All this game really did was revive this awful debate and give people more reasons to harass those they disagree with. And honestly, at this point, I highly doubt the debate will ever truly be resolved. Even with the recent reveals from 5 Laps at Freddy's and Hope Wanted 2, there are many people who still don't agree that Tales from the Pizzaplex is canon. Even if Secret of the Mimic comes out and lines up perfectly with Tales, it's clear that won't convince everyone. And even if it did, there's still Fazbear Frights, which many Tales believers don't even think is canon. So why hasn't Scott cleared this up? Granted, he doesn't often confirm or debunk theories. The last time he did that was in 2019 to confirm he wasn't the in-universe indie developer, and before that, in 2017, to resolve the mic trap and the 83 versus 87 debates. But in the past, he has had zero issue with confirming if something's canon or not. He cleared up the Silverize's canonicity in 2015 when people noticed it contradicted the games. He told everyone up front that FNAF 4's Halloween DLC wouldn't be canon, though later, during a livestream, he said that Nightmare BB could be considered canon. He confirmed Sister Location would be canon when asked, and when answering the question about the indie dev, he delved into his thought process of how to make Help Wanted canon, and clarified exactly what was and wasn't canon as a result of that story decision. But he obviously has something against clearing up the confusion over the books. A year ago, someone faked an email from Scott about the books, and Scott debunked it. But instead of taking the opportunity to actually resolve the debate, or even just say nothing at all and leave it at that, he decided to troll the community over what he knows is a huge point of contention. So why is Scott refusing to comment on the book's canonicity? I can really only think of two reasons. Either to generate more book sales, or because he's afraid of giving answers that would upset people. The first case is very exploitative of his fanbase, in my opinion, and the second case paints a gloomy future for FNAF fans who actually want answers to the story they invest so heavily in. I don't think these debates will ever truly be put to rest until Scott comes out and directly addresses it. And I think he absolutely should. I've been in the FNAF community since 2014 and haven't seen a debate as toxic as this one, with so much ridicule and harassment. For just one example, take John FNAF. He was frequently harassed for his parallel theories about the books, to the point where he became afraid to upload videos. In the Reddit post he made a few months back, he said, "This debate has been very ugly, and I have experienced the absolute worst parts of it. The hate has absolutely affected my mental health in terrible ways." The things that so many people have said and done over this debate are inexcusable. And while everyone bears full responsibility for their own actions, with nothing excusing them, I do think Scott bears some fault for the state of the debate, because Scott is absolutely aware of all of this, but he doesn't do anything. And this would be a little different if it were a debate over actual in-universe things like all other theories, but it's not. The biggest debate in FNAF for years now is debating over what we can even use to theorize and how we should be theorizing. It's frankly silly that we still don't have a statement on the canonicity of this stuff. The community isn't even arguing about Freddy Fazbear anymore. We're arguing over Reddit posts and comments, and Steam posts and interviews and scrap descriptions and scholastic emails and marketing. And not a single person enjoys this. In all my time in the FNAF community, I've never seen a single person who would actually rather have the canonicity of the books remain a mystery. And yes, mystery is obviously the core of all theories and debates and what makes all of it fun. But no one enjoys this discussion. No one is having fun. No one would be better off with it remaining a mystery, except maybe Scott, as he potentially profits off the toxic discourse. As he said in an interview back in 2014, "Strong opinions in debate aren't a bad thing at all. Anything that keeps the fire burning is a good thing." But imagine if we could instead debate things that directly pertain to the story and theorize about things that are actually fun to discuss. Is this a big favor to ask, for Scott to just directly answer the hugest lore debate in FNAF history? Yeah. But two things. It shouldn't even be a big deal in the first place. The only reason why it's a huge issue is because Scott has kept quiet all these years and never said a word about the canonicity, unlike all the other cases. This whole issue could have been stopped dead in its tracks if Scott had just clarified that Frights, or at least the Stitch line, was or wasn't in the game continuity. And that would have been that, same as with the Silverize. The problem has just snowballed. Not clarifying this is what let it become such a huge issue to begin with. Secondly, it's a perfectly reasonable favor to ask. In what other case would it be unreasonable to ask for clarification on the canonicity of a franchise's material? People did this before with FNAF, and Scott just answered it. But before I end the video, I want to talk about something that some of the community is to blame for, despite the series' mishandling of everything. And that's the absurdly high standard some fans have for something to be canon. I've seen numerous people say that it doesn't matter how closely the books line up with the games. They could have basically everything in common, but as long as there's even one thing they aren't confirmed to have in common, they might not be in the same continuity. They could be 99% the same, but have 1% that's different. So the fact that Edwin is the creator of the Mimic in the games, as well as the books, means nothing. These people seem to hold the opinion that the only way we could ever know if something's canon is if Scott specifically told us so. And they are technically right that no amount of similarities can definitively prove they're in the same continuity, but it's unreasonable to act like consistency between two things should have no impact on the matter. Because when everything important from the books lines up with the games, there comes a point where your question should change from why would this be canon to why would this not be canon? With the Silver Eyes trilogy, there are major changes made to the story that we can clearly observe. But what's the point in making an alternate universe where basically everything is the same? Look at Scott's reasoning he gave for making the Silver Eyes in AU. He felt he couldn't tell a real story in the same timeline as the games, and needed to make it a different timeline. The story he wanted to tell couldn't fit in the main universe, so he made it an alternate universe. But what do we have with Tales? We have stories that could all fit in the main timeline without error. So what reason does Scott have to make them non-canon? The implication in Scott's comment about the Silver Eyes is that if it could have fit in the game's continuity, he would have had it in the game's continuity. He made the book an alternate universe because he had to. The story wouldn't fit in with the games. So what does that mean for Tales if everything in Tales absolutely does fit in with the games? It means he had no reason to make Tales non-canon. And this is why similarities and consistency between the books and games absolutely do matter when we're determining if they're canon to each other. So like I said, I personally think, given the state of the Frights and Tales debates, it won't truly ever be settled until Scott comes out and says something. The mess of the lore in some places, as well as certain mindsets in the community, practically ensure this. Although I hope I'm wrong. I hope we can eventually leave all these toxic arguments behind us. I just want to strongly remind everyone to stay civil and respectful in these discussions, whatever you believe. So, like I said at the beginning, all of this was recorded before the Secret of the Mimic trailer. And, well, the trailer complicates things a bit. You know the point I made a moment ago about Tales fitting in perfectly with the games? Yeah, that's not really true anymore. The trailer confirmed Edwin was the creator of the Mimic, but the problem is with the factory. In this game, Edwin was the owner of Murray Costume Manor and its warehouse. And Murray Costume Manor doesn't exist in the Mimic story. Although Edwin did own a mansion, it wasn't a storefront. And the irony in Edwin's company being named after costumes is that Edwin didn't create the costumes in Tales. Fazbear Entertainment sent the costumes and he fitted them onto the animatronics. Also, something I only realized after watching ID's Fantasy's newest video is that Edwin in the trailer is referred to as a contractor, but in the story, Edwin was an employee of Fazbear Entertainment and had sold his company to them. I don't think it's that big of a deal what Edwin is called, but this seems to affect something else too. Because in the story, Edwin's factory defaults to Fazbear Entertainment due to a breach of contract, but in the trailer, Hand Unit Guy talks about Edwin's warehouse as if it still belongs to him, and we're only going to his factory to retrieve Fazbear Entertainment property. But the giant warehouse is the bigger problem. In the story, Edwin's factory was a measly 5,000 square foot building. That's like twice the space of an average house. Meanwhile, the warehouse in this game is gigantic. More than that, it's much more advanced than the old dingy factory in the story, and it's full of stuff never mentioned or even hinted at. You'd think Edwin would mention that he owned advanced office robots to do his work, or any of this other stuff. At least that there's a 50-foot Music Man animatronic in the factory. So is this the nail on the coffin for Tales games then? Because unlike some of the contradictions in Into the Pit, there is literally no way any of this could be an accident. But while I talked a lot in this video about unintentional lore contradictions, I didn't really mention intentional contradictions, retcons. A piece of media in a series doesn't need to have been non-canon for the creators to change it, or else the concept of retcons wouldn't exist. And you can decide to retcon something without decanonizing the entire source material. FNAF 2 wasn't made non-canon when Scott changed the puppet child's gender from male to female. Tales games only means that the books were written to be canon, not that nothing from it could ever be retconned, because everything canon has the potential to be retconned. And so that's what I think Murray Costume Manor is, a retcon, albeit probably the largest retcon in FNAF. I don't think the rest of Tales from the Pizzaplex should be thrown out because part of one story was changed. Obviously, newer installments in FNAF will always take precedence, but as long as details in Tales aren't a contradiction, I'm personally still going to be assuming they're canon. Anyway, those are just my 2 cents on the matter. And now for a bonus segment about the recent interactive novel, Return to the Pit. I couldn't fit a discussion of it anywhere else in the video, so I'm tagging it onto the end here. Nothing could have prepared me for this. This book is the most unhinged thing I've ever read. The Yellow Rabbit runs over Oswald with a car 3 times. There's an ending where you put on bunny ears, start thinking you're a bunny, and then sit down with the Yellow Rabbit and your mom, who's also wearing bunny ears, and together, as one happy bunny family, you watch a documentary about bunnies. Forever. There's an entire route where Chip, as an adult in the present, recognizes you from the past and has an entire team already assembled that's dedicated to killing the Yellow Rabbit if it ever showed up again. They're armed with weapons and everything. Except it turns out the Yellow Rabbit is actually their leader and no one can see, and this leads to Oswald getting shot in one ending. You can also be sucked inside an 8-bit video game in Freddy's where you save the missing children from ever being killed, which ends up changing the past so that no murders ever happened and William Afton was arrested. In other words, you can literally time travel and undo all of Five Nights at Freddy's. But in terms of the continuity issue, I don't think Return to the Pit actually changes the discussion that much, although there are a couple things to note. Firstly, this book, unlike the original story and the game, has the children being killed in the safe room rather than the party room, which is how it should have been. It also only shows there being 5 dead children in the room, although you can visit the safe room one day before and find a single dead child there, whereas later you find out that the 5 dead children were all killed together, implying that this one child might be separate from them. So there could still be 6 dead children in this story. The book also says that the pizzeria's building was split in 2 after it closed, with half becoming Jeff's Pizza and the other half being abandoned, so that Freddy's is actually twice as big as Jeff's, with Freddy's Arcade extending into the boarded up area. But this contradicts the Into the Pit game, where Freddy's layout is identical to Jeff's and clearly wasn't split in 2. Beside these differences though, there's actually a route you can take in the book that's pretty much identical to the original story. So is Return to the Pit canon as well? I really don't know. Its description calls itself a retelling of Into the Pit. Interpret that as you will. But this book certainly does not make a single thing any clearer. And that finishes up everything I wanted to say. Comment below your own thoughts on Into the Pit and the whole books debate. If you enjoyed this way too long discussion, I'd appreciate it if you gave the video a like. Also, subscribe and hit the bell if you want to be notified the next time I make a video. Bye.